author Anne Lamott's brother was 10 years old and he had a report that he needed to get finished on birds. He had had 3 months to do the report, but it was due the next day. And he was sitting at the kitchen table, tears in his eyes, surrounded by pens, papers, pencils, and books on birds, completely immobilized by the hugeness of the task in front of him. Then his dad sat at the table, put his arm around him and said, "Bird by bird, buddy. Just take it bird by bird." It is so easy to lean into the energy of Anna's younger brother when you have a big task ahead of you, feeling immobilized by the hugeness of whatever is in front of you. Whether that is literally just cleaning your home or starting your new business. I call this the Overwhelm Do Nothing pipeline. In this podcast episode, I want to talk about how to embrace bird by bird energy and how to avoid slipping into the Overwhelm Do Nothing pipeline. Welcome to the Grow with Intention podcast, the podcast for people who want to create a life that feels good. So one big important part of embracing bird by bird energy is focusing on choosing instead of knowing. In the book Time Warrior, the author talks about his client who wanted to build websites. She wanted clients, but she just didn't know who to call. So he switched her focus from knowing to choosing. They went through her whole email list and chose 20 people at random. Then she chose to make the calls. She ended up with 4 new clients. When you're focused on knowing, you're usually really wanting to create some certainty for yourself. You want to know that the next step that you take is the right step. You want to know that taking that step will lead you to the outcome that you want. You want to know that you're not wasting your time. You end up being the boy on the table, tears in your eyes, focused on how many birds there are in your bird report rather than the next bird. But when you switch your focus from knowing to choosing, that's when you start making progress. Don't get me wrong, I think that there is some value in sitting in knowing mode. I think there is some value into going into activities with some kind of strategy or some kind of belief about what you think is going to work. But when you're in or you're about to enter the Overwhelm Do Nothing pipeline, instead of making a fuss over which bird is next, instead of obsessing with whether the action that you're about to take is aligned, to get yourself moving, it's often more effective to ask yourself, what am I most willing to do next? And then choose your next step. This is a practice that you can get better and better at, but it is kind of like a meditation. You need to keep on going back to that question. For example, every single time that I declutter, every single time I do any kind of home project, and if you've watched any of my vlog content, like you've seen this in action so many times, I'll just get to a point where I'm like, what have I done? Like everything's everywhere. It's chaos. I'm overwhelmed and I don't know what to do next. So my go-to mental move is always choosing the very next step and focusing on that very next step. Then when I get to the end of that next step, I choose again and I just focus on the very next step. I try not to focus anywhere beyond that point. Whenever I notice myself thinking big picture, it is a meditative process of like going back to that question of what am I most willing to do next? Choosing to actively zoom back in. And the more that you do this, the easier it becomes. In every podcast episode, I have Recs of the Week where you can dive deeper into the topics that I talked about in today's episode. The Rec of the Week this week is Time Warrior by Steve Chandler. I would describe this book as a philosophical approach to time management, and the podcast episode that I just made is super related to this podcast episode, which is how to pick one thing when you want to do everything. I'm going to have that linked on the screen if you're on YouTube, or it'll be in the show notes. If you are on Spotify, Apple, wherever you happen to be listening, it'll be around. You'll be able to find it. I appreciate you so much and I'll see you soon.